And hello there. This is Talk Music Talk with Boice. I am Boice, your host. Thank you for listening to Talk Music Talk, or TMT as I occasionally refer to it. Talk Music Talk, or TMT, is a weekly music interview podcast where I have long-form conversations, discussions with people connected to music from different genres and different backgrounds, established and emerging singers, songwriters, musicians, music therapists, music writers. And on this episode, I had the great pleasure of speaking to Gabriel Kahane, singer, composer, pianist. I first discovered his music on Bandcamp several years ago on the release of his 2014 album, The Ambassador. Excellent. And then in 2018, he went and released another excellent album called Book of Travelers, late 2018 that came out. And Book of Travelers is a song cycle of his traveling on Amtrak and the people he encountered there and their stories. In the conversation, he explains the impetus behind the album. He talks about the people he met, what he learned doing this. He also talks about how important literature has been in his work. He discusses raising a child, being a dad, and much more. After the conversation, you will hear a song from Book of Travelers. He said I could choose any song from the album, and it was very hard because it really is such a great album. But I finally chose one. I chose Friends of Bill, one of my favorite songs from the album, Book of Travelers. Here it is, without further ado, my conversation with Gabriel Kahane. Enjoy. I enjoyed your performance when I saw you, was it last August?
September?
Yeah, September.
Yeah, thank you.
For the release show. And I am just curious, your songs lend so well to literature. Are you writing short stories? Is that a plan? Have you written short stories?
I haven't written... I've done a little bit of prose writing. I've written a couple essays. I wrote something for The New Yorker online when my previous album, The Ambassador, came out. And I wrote a little piece for The New York Times when Book of Travelers was at BAM about 9 months before the album. There's a literary agent who's been hounding me for about 5 years to do a book. And it's something I would love to do at some point, but I feel like there's so much music that I want to write. So I take it as a compliment, but I'm not there yet. Yeah,
to squeeze a book into. So you're like a big reader, or is fiction being your thing?
I'm a pretty big reader. Yeah, I think I was a pretty lousy student in high school and in college. I actually didn't finish high school. Yeah, and then I spent a year at conservatory as a jazz pianist, and then I transferred, somehow got into Brown, which is like the only Ivy League school where you can drop out of high school and they still let you in. And it turns out there was actually an admissions error. The year that I got in as a transfer student, they had miscalculated the rate of matriculation of the freshman class, so they let in way too many transfer students. So I think my getting in was a mistake. But I had this professor there in my senior year. He taught a Faulkner class, and he gave the students the option of doing a creative response rather than a final paper. And 10 years later, I realized that he had sort of unlocked the door of what my career has been about, which is sort of like often conducting research that feels kind of academic or journalistic, but then rather than writing 10,000 words for Harper's or writing a paper in an academic journal, I'm writing songs. So literature is very, very close to me. I think, often you get this question. I love that you started there because, so often you do an interview and people are like, what are your influences? And I tend to try to like bypass that and get to talking about literature because, for example, I don't know if you know the German novelist W.G. Sebald. He wrote Rings of Saturn and Austerlitz and The Emigrants. And he's a huge inspiration and influence for me, particularly with Book of Travelers, which is sort of, it's a travelogue, and his book Rings of Saturn, which is this very digressive book that's framed around his walking tour of the English countryside. But using that as a frame, he's able to write about, Renaissance painting and, surgery in the 16th century and the death camps in World War II and the silk trade and all these things that seem like they have nothing to do with one another. But because he's always coming back to his travel, you sort of go along for the ride. And so that was very much in my mind when I was working on Book of Travelers, that it could be about a whole bunch of different things as long as they're sort of unified by this theme of travel.
Okay. So there was never like a leap where you can do that in literature, but you can also do that in music for you. Had you not previously thought about that?
Well, I guess this new record was the first one where I took a specific piece of literature and thought, I want to try to emulate or, work on this model and bring it into music. But I've often written songs, like on the micro level, I've written songs inspired by books. Like 2 records ago on Where Are the Arms, which came out in 2011, there's a song called L.A. that's a response to Joan Didion's Play It As It Lays. And even going back to my very first album, there's a song called The Faithful that was inspired by a Claire Massoud novel. I don't even remember.
Yeah.
It was like her 9/11 book. I don't remember what it was called. So I've always been kind of engaging with literature as a way of writing. And I guess the other thing that sort of sets Book of Travelers apart from the work that I had done previously is that whereas with The Ambassador, I was responding to a lot of secondary sources like films and buildings and novels. Book of Travelers, the research was with other humans. Yeah.
Did you approach the people? Well, I guess explain the concept and then I'll ask that.
Yeah. So basically, about 3 weeks before the 2016 presidential election, I bought a series of train tickets. And I decided that regardless of the outcome of the election, I was going to get on a train and just talk to people. Yeah. And there were sort of 2 main thrusts to my desire to take this trip. One was going back to the Sebald novel. Yeah. I had written 15 or 16 songs before going on this trip, and they were all sort of loosely preoccupied with travel, but in a more historical sense, like the evolution of travel. And I had gotten interested in that in the first place because, there's this old kind of cliche that the sophomore album is always about travel because you've been on the road for the first time. The Ambassador was actually my 3rd album, but it was the first album that I toured properly. So I had those experiences of being on the tour bus and being in new places and so on and so forth. And I wanted to kind of bypass the obvious, sophomore travel record or what would have been my senior record, I guess, 4th year record. But I started thinking about, travel began as a religious impulse. There were religious pilgrimages. And then in the 18th century, well, not strictly, you also have migratory patterns, but I think of like modern travel begins with religious pilgrimages. And then in the 18th century, people of means in Europe sent their sons off on the grand tour to kind of see the sights in Italy and so on and so forth. And then in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, you had factory owners who realized that their workers would be more efficient if they gave them time off. And so leisure travel was born in the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, in the States, around the WPA and the New Deal and the Federal Writers Project, there's a lot of writing that sort of brings back the religious element in the way that the national park system is talked about. Like the sublime, go find God in the trees. Okay. And so I was interested in this kind of like cyclical thing of starting with the religious pilgrimage and ending up with it again. But that was all very kind of cerebral, and the songs that I was writing didn't feel like they hung together. And so I wanted to take a trip that would provide me with a kind of narrative framework, and that's where the Rings of Saturn Sebald book comes in. But then probably the more interesting impulse was just coming out of what was going on in the country. And, as horrified as I was by the candidate who's now the president.
And likewise.
I have a kind of fundamental belief in the goodness of people. And that's not to say that people don't have biases. And I think one of the things that we've learned in the last couple of years is it's like, no matter how woke you are, you still have more to learn. Yeah. And I think that's like a really important lesson for progressives to keep in mind, that we can't get away from bias. It's part of like how we sort the world, and we can be, cognizant of them and work against them. But anyway, so basically I just I didn't believe that there was a transitive property of douchebaggery,
Yes.
where just because you support someone means you're as terrible a human as he is. And I figured this is coming from some place of desperation. And also, if you pay attention, that income inequality has been rampant in this country increasingly over the last 40 years since Reagan and the rewriting of the tax code. And so I wanted to. It wasn't that I thought that I wasn't going to encounter people who had deep-seated racial animus in their hearts, but I think I just wanted to understand the texture myself rather than having it be digested for me by a media system that profits from our division.
Yeah.
And the digital space felt so toxic in the months leading up to the election. And I just wanted to kind of, it was, I guess the third component of the trip was just to sort of detox and turn off the computer. I didn't, I had no phone. I brought my laptop, but it was on airplane mode the whole time. And so that was sort of the thrust of the trip, was like to understand the systems that allowed our now president, who is a symptom to, to do what he did.
Yes. So do you think it made a difference that you had set your travel plans regardless of what the outcome was going to be?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think like so many people, I thought Hillary was going to win.
Yeah.
And I thought I was going to be going on this sort of like empathy tour. And I think that as a result of the election going the other way, I was in a much more vulnerable place than I would have been. And so I was, for the first, I guess in a way, for the entirety of the trip, I was in a state of kind of shock.
Yeah. Because it was 2 weeks. Right?
It was 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But at the same time, by the first meal, the first dinner that I had, actually, no, not the first dinner, because I think that first train, the one from New York to Chicago, it didn't really get me outside of my comfort zone.
Yeah.
And I might have talked about that at the show. The people I encountered were very familiar. It was like a psychotherapist from the Upper West Side and hippies from Vermont. And they were lovely people, but it wasn't until I think it was my second night on the Empire Builder from Chicago over to the Pacific Northwest where I was just really outside of my comfort zone in a way that felt so healing and wonderful. And I felt like it was the total inverse of everything that I had been experiencing online in the preceding months. Yeah.
Was it in your nature to be the type of person to approach people? Like, how much did you have to step out of your comfort zone just to go up to strangers?
So, in some respects, it's very much in my nature. My mom's a psychologist, and for most of my career, people are always like, your dad's a musician. What is? And I adore my father. He's an amazing concert pianist and conductor and extremely thoughtful person. Jeffrey, yeah. But I really feel like this project is sort of for my mom in a way. She has this ability to, not just with clients, but she'll be in a social situation. And famously, there was a colleague of my father's, who will remain nameless, but a musician who had come to town. This was when we were living in Santa Rosa. And this person came over to our house, and they had never met before, my mom and this musician. And 10 minutes later, they were in this deep, deep conversation about this musician's therapist. Yeah. And my mom ended up helping this person to realize that they were in a really, really toxic relationship with their therapist, and ended up dumping this therapist of 20 years. And that's sort of like the kind of person that she is. She just sort of effortlessly draws people out. And so I don't know that I totally share that gift, but I love talking to people. And I think as far as the comfort zone question is concerned, there are a couple of things I would say. One, the train itself and the dining car of the train is just kind of like a social lubricant. It just lends itself to people talking to each other. And I think I was aware of a couple things. One, I was aware of the fact that being a white male made this easy for me in a way that it wouldn't be if you know if I were wearing a hijab or what have you. But then the other thing that was like really kind of crazy was confronting my bias toward people who read to me as potentially Trump voters.
Okay.
And my discomfort in there were certain conversations where I had to kind of like steel myself for what was about to come. And I think it was important for me to recognize that, because we, those of us who believe in racial justice and economic justice, we talk constantly about diversity, but we have blind spots. And I think that it's very easy to say, well, this person voted for a white supremacist, therefore I don't have to include them in my, in my conception of humanity. And I just think that doesn't work. Like, I think if we actually want to heal our, big structural relationships, we have to be radical in our empathy. Yeah. And obviously there is a limit to that. And I think we've sort of seen the limit of that, like when it comes to, the detention of children, the separation of children from their parents. And that was a moment for me where I really questioned my, the comfort from which I take that attitude of, I'm this white dude living in Brooklyn. I'm totally secure. And I want to continue to believe in this idea of radical empathy. But I think also when you look back at the 1960s, and I think a lot about Dr. King and the idea that he knew that in order to build a coalition of people who would support civil rights, that he had to appeal to racist white people on an economic level. Yes. That he was going to have to kind of like turn the other cheek and say, I'm fighting for you, even though I know that
this way.
And so I guess I became more aware of my own, my own prejudices when I would encounter someone where I was like, oh, that's the guy who voted for Trump. And yet I think once I sort of got over that hump, basically everyone I talked to was incredibly decent and incredibly kind. I think I encountered one person on my entire trip who I didn't like. And he was a libertarian software engineer who lived on a boat off of Seattle. Yeah. And he was just fucking obnoxious. He was sort of like, let me tell you why it doesn't matter that Hillary didn't win. I'm a data guy. And he just wanted to talk about numbers. And it was just like, it was so kind of tone deaf and he, he was kind of like mansplaining, and his wife was there and she couldn't get a word in. But other than that, I probably talked to like 95 people. A lot of them I have no idea who they voted for. Many of them I assume voted for Trump, and some who I assumed voted for Trump did not. And there were surprises there where I made assumptions about people, and continually I was proved wrong. It's all, I feel like we're all constantly learning.
Was it disheartening in any way when you discover that, oh, I thought I was this, but I'm not? Like, I have these thoughts about yourself when you're coming across these people that you made assumptions
about myself?
Yeah,
absolutely. I think that it really, in a way, it was like going to rehab, because I think it fundamentally shifted something for me in the way that I approach people. And I think there's a lesson there for everyone, regardless of where you sit on this spectrum, that so much of any kind of prejudice just comes from ignorance and from lack of, lack of contact from those who are different. That's part of what I love so much about New York City.
Mm-hmm.
It's what I love about the subway.
Yeah.
It's like, and it's one of the reasons that I really, even though my wife and I are thinking about maybe moving somewhere else, one of the reasons that we would love to raise our daughter in New York, not that it's perfect, but that for me growing up, I grew up in very white places. And while, my schools and my parents taught the idea of, racial justice, it was a concept. And I think it wasn't really until I moved to New York when I was 21 that I started to have a remotely diverse community. And so the idea of being able to raise my child in a place where like you don't have to teach the idea, it's just implemented by example. That's really appealing to me, and it's one of the things that I cherish about New York that I think you see it in some other cities, and we still have obviously issues with policing and systemic bias that crops up in all sorts of spaces. But I do like my landlords are Orthodox Jews. My next door neighbors are Pakistani Muslims, and those next door neighbors are an older white gay couple who are really into leather. So it's like, to me, this is New York.
Good coverage. Did you get this from your parents? This concept of racial justice, and like, where did that come from?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent, yes, but also I think actually it was a slow I don't know, kind of a slow awakening. I think somehow when I was working on The Ambassador, I was in residence at North Carolina, University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and I became really close with an English professor named Heidi Kim. And I was doing a lot of teaching. I would go into English classes, humanities classes, and I would talk about the research that I was doing in Los Angeles and so on and so forth. And Heidi actually teaches a course on California literature, and she had come across this book that had just been published on the death of Latasha Harlins. And for your listeners who don't know, Latasha Harlins was an African-American teenager who, shortly after the videotaped beating of Rodney King, went to buy a bottle of orange juice and was shot to death in a just kind of horrific, I don't even know what you call it. She was murdered. And the full picture, which I don't totally give in the song that I wrote, Empire Liquor Mart, is that there had been tension between the Korean community and the black community, and there had been acts of violence perpetrated by the black community onto the Korean community and vice versa. So in a way it was sort of retaliatory. It didn't come out of nowhere, and yet it's still just like a horrific, shocking crime. And I think this was in the wake of the George Zimmerman being acquitted of murdering Trayvon Martin. And while I was working on the song, Michael Brown was killed. And the thing that kept coming up, and I guess this was maybe the moment where I sort of woke up, as it were, was realizing the way that black kids were put on trial in death. And I think the thing about writing about Latasha Harlins and looking for there was this moment that sort of unlocked the entire album for me. And it was weirdly, I had read this quotation by Baudrillard, the French philosopher, about how the best way to view Los Angeles is from a jet landing at LAX at night, when you can see the entire city lit up. And then I was reading these other accounts of the uprising in 92, and people talked about flying in and seeing both the fires and the lights. And that's where that lyric, Two Kinds of Light, came from. And and I had just read this book about the death of Latasha Harlins, and I was thinking, like, where is the solace for this child who was murdered? And I was thinking, well, she's floating up into the afterlife, and she sees this kind of insane, terrifying beauty of the city on fire. And I guess what I was interested in was the idea of, like celebrating her as a child and as an innocent child, and to try to do the opposite thing of what seems to happen so frequently in the media space, where it's like, police officer shoots black kid, and then we start saying, well, he was no saint or whatever. And it's like, what
like
about
he almost deserved.
Right. And that was solidly in Obama's second term. And I think that, like, a lot of white liberals, even though we all said, oh yeah, Obama being elected in no way means that we're in a post-racial society, but we kind of let our guard down, I think. And so I think it was during his second term, and starting with, Trayvon Martin and then Ferguson. I think maybe Ferguson was kind of like a wake-up call for me. Because it was the first kind of uprising in my adult life where I was really kind of glued to the news, and Flint, and just like seeing all these systemic things. But yeah, I don't know. It's weirdly become like a pretty central preoccupation in my work, and I don't know how that happened.
Yeah. How do you, because you're a dad now, right? How do you think you will raise a child to impart, like, what's going on in the world, and that you grow up there? Some people grow up with a certain amount of privilege, right?
I think probably by trying to expose her to give her a context for our privilege. And I think I wrote this piece for the Oregon Symphony last year dealing with housing and homelessness and housing discrimination. And by the time this airs, I suspect it will have become public that I'm starting this 3-year partnership with the Oregon Symphony to be their creative chair, which is a new position.
Congratulations.
We worked. Oh, thank you. We worked really closely with the Maybell Community Center in downtown Portland, and they sort of create community for people living in extreme poverty. They have been at it for 24, 25 years. And before there was research, they sort of intuited that community is a very strong indicator of health outcomes, that, it's as strong an indicator as, like, smoking or diet. And that they recognize that very often people living in extreme poverty are also extremely isolated. And one of the things that my wife was talking about was the idea of trying to bring Vera, our daughter, to the Maybell Center when she's old enough to kind of understand what's going on there. But I don't know. I mean, it's terrifying. And we, as many, I think, parents wrestled with, it's like, what is this world that we're bringing our child into? I mean, even setting aside all the questions of racial and economic justice is the question of the planet. And like, is there going to be a place for our kid to grow up? And I think my wife, her grandparents were founding members of the Sierra Club. She grew up in Oregon. If you grow up in Oregon, you're sort of like automatically an environmentalist. So she's always been kind of pushing me in that direction. But I think since our daughter was born, within a few weeks, I don't remember in which direction of the UN putting out its statement that, if we don't get our act together in the next 12 years, it's game over. And so we've become really hardcore about, no single-use plastics, trying to avoid buying anything. We got rid of Amazon. We're just trying to really, really be thoughtful about everything that we consume in the broadest sense. But to the question of like how to raise a child, I mean, I'm at the very beginning of this. I have no
She's
idea.
what, 7 months?
7 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you have a little bit of time.
Yeah,
right?
I got a little time to figure it out. Yeah.
So going back to your travels on the train, what was your approach? Did you tell people that you were a songwriter or just have conversations and
it was,
see what happens?
You know, what was kind of a blessing about it was the fact that I had written 15 or 16 songs going into the trip, many of which, I think 14 of which have not seen the light of day.
Yeah.
I didn't know how much I was trying to get out of the trip as a writer. And so I was kind of, rather than monitoring every situation as like, oh, could this become fodder for a song? I was very much in the moment. And when people asked what I was doing, I would say, I'm a songwriter. I live in New York City. I wanted to get out of my cosmopolitan bubble and see America and talk to people. And depending on who I was talking to, I would slightly modulate what I was saying. In the case of the woman about whom I wrote "What If I Told You," which comes toward the end of the record, where this very wealthy black woman basically calls into question the whole project, which is like so kind of wild in the way that sometimes life is tidier aesthetically than art, you know. And I think it was the second to last day of my trip that I met this incredible woman. And with her, because of the way our conversation started, and because I could sort of sense from things that she had said that, you know, she was kind of far left on the political spectrum, I sort of, I was, what's the word that I'm looking for? I was a little bit provocative. I basically said, you know, I'm trying to find the humanity in people who voted for Trump. Yeah. And then she said, "Oh yeah, well, what if I told you?" Okay. You know, and that was sort of how that song came to pass. But yeah, I mean, I think in the same way that I think there's a way in which I'm like a wannabe journalist, and you're going to say whatever it is that's going to draw people out the most and make them feel the most comfortable. And so, you know, there was one encounter. I met these two guys who I wish I had written a song about, but I couldn't figure it out. These two guys who met on a basically train enthusiast online forum, like a Reddit for train enthusiasts. And these guys are like full-time retired train geeks. And they started a blog where they write about their train and food adventures. And one of them was retired Air Force, and the other was a retired computer repairman, and very Midwestern. This was one where I got it right, you know, that they were on the right side of the political spectrum. And when I sat down with them and I kind of had a sense of who they were, I said, "Yeah, I'm a musician." They said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm a musician. I'm from New York. I'm trying, you know, I was trying to get out of my cosmopolitan bubble. You know, sometimes I think we in New York sort of, you know, we think we know what's best and we really don't." And he was like, "Damn right you don't." And so I think I would be kind of self-deprecating or unassuming in ways to get people to sort of open up. And in every case except for one, there was one like very kind of heartbreaking thing that happened toward the end of the trip, involving a woman who had been very forthcoming, telling me about she and her husband were having their roof redone. Her husband was a veteran, and they had to wait for something for the VA to give them a payment in order for the roof to get paid for, and so on and so forth. And then finally, like 40 minutes into the conversation, I had just been, you know, asking her questions. She was telling me about her dogs and so on and so forth. And then she said, "And what are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a musician. I gave the spiel," and she fell totally silent. And she was eating a waffle, I remember. And finally, we just sat there in silence. She was, you know, got to her last bite of the waffle, and she said, "One more bite." And she finished it and she left. And earlier that morning, I had been walking through the sleeper car where my little roomette was, and I had seen someone who appeared to be an older man in transition.
Yeah.
And sort of like pre-op, but sort of on the way.
Yeah.
And a couple hours later, I was walking back through the car, and I realized that this person was the husband of this woman, and that they were dining separately because there was discomfort around the transition, and there was a whole universe in that encounter, and of course, in retrospect, I totally understood why she had shut down, because she was in the middle of this major transition in two senses of the word. But aside from that, I probably talked to 90 or more people. I mean, just from calculating 3 meals a day for 13 days, 6 to 9 people a day. Talked to a lot of people. So, yeah, I guess I wasn't sitting there with a tape recorder. I transcribed as much as I could remember.
Okay.
I would have these conversations, and then I would go back to my sleeper, and I would furiously write down everything that I could remember, which was useful because when I got back many months later, or not many months later, but when I got home, I sort of fell into a block, which is not normal for me. I usually just write. But I think there were these questions for me about the ethics of writing these stories, writing these songs. And the fact that I had everything written down was really helpful, because it wasn't until several months later that I was finally able to really dig into the document of my diary and figure out, okay, this is a story I need to tell. This is a story I need to tell.
And you mean the ethics of, do you have the right to tell these people's story without them knowing?
Well, I guess both without them knowing and also just the kind of classic academic questions of privilege and voice, and I think ultimately the way that I was able to rationalize that what I was doing was ethical was that fundamentally the project is a diary of my experience, and I sort of put enough of myself out there that the other stories that are threaded are really just components of my experience. And I think also, I'm not making any money with this record. I mean, the label, it'll be a long time before they break even. I think it would be a really different thing if I were actually, profiting from these stories. And I don't even know in terms of like the sort of capitalist ethics of it. I'm not sure that I have a clear sense, because so much of, literary fiction, people are drawing people from their lives constantly, and you don't pay out a royalty to everyone who appears in your book.
Thank goodness.
So I don't know. I mean, what do you think about that? Like, what do you think about
I've written fiction and stuff, so I've definitely taken inspiration from people's lives and stories, and I feel like unless you're using something that would easily identify them, that it's okay. Right. Because it is your perspective and through your lens, and you were in that experience, so it's open to you to using your art.
I think, the other thing that was interesting for me is thinking about all the conversation, going back to the question of privilege, the conversations that we have about privilege, and the way that sometimes we can be so reductive as to what constitutes privilege. Yeah. And I think particularly in that encounter with the woman on the train to New Orleans, as she was heading to Mississippi, she made it very clear early in the conversation that she had a lot of money and sort of like wanted me to know that. Yeah. But she wanted, not because she was, being a braggart, but because she was trying to contextualize the structural racism that she was facing, in spite of the fact that she was able to send 3 kids to the Ivy League with no loans and no scholarships and pay cash. And like, who does that? Who pays cash to send, their 3 kids to the Ivy League? And I was aware in that conversation that I'm a straight white guy and I'm also in a lot of debt. And yet I don't ever feel physically imperiled. And yet it's, you know, it's a more complicated dynamic than just like, you're white, you have privilege. And I thought about that more when I encountered, there was a truck driver from North Dakota about whom I wrote a song that didn't make it onto the record. He and his two sisters were in a family band growing up, and they were getting the family band back together to play at their aunt's 90th birthday.
Okay.
And he was only able to afford to take the train because his sisters had bought him a ticket. And I think North Dakota is 97% white. And I imagined, you know, the things that you see on Twitter, sort of like social justice Twitter, like check your privilege. And I imagined like, what would it mean to this guy who has lived at the poverty line for 40 years if you were like, check your privilege? He would be like, I literally don't understand what you're talking about. And I think those, you know, realizing that in that situation, I was clearly the more privileged by every metric. And I think, you know, the record also deals a little bit with mental illness. And I think that is something that's often invisible. And we don't talk about what it means to have the privilege of mental health or to have, you know, the barrier to society, you know, barrier to being fully functioning in society of you know, living with mental illness. So I guess what I want for myself, and then maybe by extension for my listeners, is for us to all, you know, continue to fight the impassioned fight that we're all engaged in for justice, but also just to be mindful that everything is always a little more complex than we make it out to be.
Instead of painting everyone with big broad strokes like comic book villains, that there's complexity to human nature.
And I think particularly, you know, I think Twitter is such a terrible force in our society, because it kind of necessarily means that people are only going to be engaging on the surface. And you have, I mean, one place where I think we see it constantly, and you may, working at the Strand, you might be hip to this, but the like young adult Twitter and the way that there are all these books that end up not getting published because there are these Twitter pylons where someone has read an advanced copy of the book and says, you know, X, Y, and Z in this book are problematic, which it may very well be. But then there's this pylon of all these people who, you know, can't have read the book because they don't have an advanced copy.
Because there's such a limited number going out.
Right. And yet, you know, the books end up not being published. And again, maybe it's good that they're not being published. Maybe there really is super problematic content. But that sort of tendency to reflexively pile on to something without having all the facts. And, you know, almost every news cycle, we see corrections being made in the moment. And you have big time journalists reporting things that 6 hours later we know aren't true. And that just gives fuel to the you know, the fire of like, oh, it's all fake news. And so I think it's tough, because obviously Twitter has done great things for activism in a lot of spaces, but I feel like there's probably a version of a social media network that could be a conduit for activism without all the shit that goes along with it. It's so toxic.
Dream on, Gabriel. So just kind of wrapping up, have you heard from anyone that you met on the train since the album's been released? Has anyone reached out?
Yeah, I've had an ongoing correspondence with a woman, an ex-Mennonite, who shortly before the election, she was doing some work. I'm not going to say where in the interest of protecting her anonymity. But she had fallen in with a group of folk artists who basically had an intervention with her and got her to leave the sect. And so she voted for the first time in 2016. She was in this very, very repressive sect. And she and I have kept in touch, and she's actually come to see me perform. I wrote a song about her that didn't make it onto the record. Sort of a composite of two women I met. And there are two folks about whom I wrote songs that are on the record who I corresponded with before I wrote the songs. And I still haven't, I don't know what it is that I'm afraid of. I think I need to just write to them and say, hey, these songs ended up on the record. And a few people have popped up on Facebook, I think, when there was some press, realized that we had shared a meal. And, but it's been fairly limited, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's a beautiful album.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, from the beginning to the end, it just completely works.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations to that. Where is the best place for people to keep up with you online?
I guess that's a good question. Instagram. I'm Gabriel Kahane on all of the social media platforms, and
easy to find.
Despite the fact that I hate Twitter. At Gabriel Kahane. Also, if you write an email to gabrielkahanelist@gmail.com, I can add people to a very unobtrusive email list.
Sounds good.
Yeah, music's at gabrielkahane.bandcamp.com.
Great. Gabriel, this was wonderful. I'm glad we got together.
I'm so glad. 2 years later. Thank you for having me.
It was worth it, dude.
Thanks.
Those neighbor kids, they meant no harm. I came home from church to find a 3-alarm. To my sister, she gave us a key. 3 years, 1 room, 2 kids, and me. But it would lift my burden, all the power, the comfort in His name. Is that so much to ask? To believe and be unashamed. Stay after church for friends of friends of Bill. I tell the story of my son, his need the pain to kill. How I saved all the money in a box in a drawer. How I gave it to him, knew what it was for. But it would lift my burden, all the power, the comfort in His name. Is that so much to ask? To believe and be unashamed. Visits get harder. He lowers his eyes, and every time they'll get darker. I show him the pictures drawn by his kid. Smother someone with your love. Isn't loving it all in this world hard enough?
And that was Friends of Bill from Book of Travelers by Gabriel Kahane, out now on Nonesuch Records. Get the album. Also get the Ambassadors. You will not be disappointed with either one. Buy his music. You should also see him live. He's an excellent performer. And make sure you head on over to GabrielKahane.com. I am online also at talkmusictalk.com for more podcast information and to stream every single episode. You can also find me on Instagram at This Is Boice. And I have some call to actions for you. If you would love to help the show out, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it on social media or email it to a friend or leave a 5-star rating or review, especially on iTunes, because this all helps to grow the TMT audience. There is also an app. It is free for iPhone and Android, and you can get it wherever you like to get your apps. And you can subscribe to the podcast in many places: Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and many, many more. And one more place, SoundCloud. That's right. Starting with episode 100, soundcloud.com/This Is Boice. Thank you so much for listening to this episode with Gabriel Kahane. I know you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed talking to him. Until next time, and there will be a next time, this one's for you, Liz.